So welcome to this very special episode of Quake It Up, joined by a whole new person in the form of Mark Russ. Thank you very much for joining us, Mark. Why are we here? Well, we're mainly here to talk about your new book, Quaker Shaped Christianity, How the Jesus Story and the Quaker Way Fit Together, which came out towards the end of last year.
Yeah.
So going to be talking about that, but for those of you who are watching who don't know, haven't heard of Mark Russ before, if this is your first interaction with Mark Russ or you've heard of him but want to know more, he is a Quaker theologian, writer and blogger. He blogs under the name The Jolly Quaker, which I think is a fantastic name. How did you come across that one?
So I chose Jolly Quaker as my blog name because it's from a quote by Thomas Kelly, who's a Quaker mystic, writing in the early part of the 20th century. And he wrote a book called A Testament of Devotion. And there's a line in there where he says, "I'd rather be jolly St. Francis singing his canticle to the sun than a dour, sober-sides Quaker." And I thought, I want to be both.
Yes.
I want to be jolly and a Quaker. So I thought that's where that name sprung from.
Big fan of Thomas Kelly. I've got A Testament to Devotion somewhere. Not many books like it. I'm actually going to ask you about book recommendations you would share as well. So I mean I think that one's just amazing. So I suppose it's really, and you sort of mentioned this in your book. It's quite difficult as Quakers to talk about beliefs and things like that, and especially about the Christian beliefs, without talking about ourselves. And I think this is what many Quakers are battle with when they start writing about their faith. They have to start talking about themselves. So I suppose the first question is, how did you find yourself coming into Quakerism? You weren't a Quaker through childhood. How did that story happen?
So I grew up in a non-religious family. My dad was and still is very much an atheist, even though he was confirmed in the Church of England, just sort of a social kind of Christianity that he has rejected. I was christened into the Church of England to keep my grandma happy, but I wasn't raised going to church. Sundays were for watching lots of Doctor Who, and I mean, cultural Christianity is what I absorbed in terms of carol services and those sort of things. But when I was 16, I was very much an atheist. The experiences I'd had of other Christians weren't great, and didn't make me think that Christianity wasn't really for me. And at 16, I was very anti-religion, and I saw it as a really bad force in the world. And then I started to come out as gay when I was 17, 18. And when I came out, that coming out was accompanied by some really intense spiritual experiences. It was like by accepting my whole self, I'd tapped in to the spiritual aspect of myself that I'd not had access to. And I needed somewhere to explore that. And a good friend of mine who I'm still very, very close with, who I went to school with, her mum was a Quaker. And I got my first sort of Quaker literature through her. And I did A-level history, which focused particularly on the English Civil War. And so the Quakers came up there. And discovering the Quakers was a bit of a light bulb moment, particularly hearing that Quakers didn't think the Bible was the last word. And for me, struggling to make sense of belief in God, but seeing the Bible as a huge barrier, that was a sort of sign of, oh, okay, these people might have something to offer me. And the fact that I didn't need, the being gay just wasn't an issue for Quakers. So that's and I didn't need to believe anything. So I could go along and have the space to explore this developing spirituality. And then it sort of, 20 years later, I'm very
fully fledged Quaker.
I think 20 years ago me would be quite surprised at where I'm at now. But it's like the spaciousness of Quakers has given me the the space to change and to develop and grow in my Quakerism. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that's very similar in parts to my story as well. I think that's a real great thing about Quakerism, and I think that is a real in for so many people. That is this safe space to practice spirituality, to try and think and have the time to think about it, because that's what a meeting for worship is, isn't it? You're given that time to interact with that spirituality personally and very um, acutely. So then, obviously, talking about bringing all this stuff up to explain, this is who I am. This is how I see Quakerism. This is what's important to me. This is my baggage that I'm bringing with me. Was that hard talking about you? And as I said, you bring out quite personal information about your coming out. You're talking about your beliefs about your body. You talk about quite a lot of personal insights that you've had. Was that tricky to write in a book?
No, I'm somebody who very readily spills my guts. Like I will very happily wear my heart on my sleeve. I find it very difficult to. I'm one of those people that finds it very, very difficult to hide how I feel about things. I really think the process of coming out was a game changer in that I could really see myself becoming. The thing that prompted me to come out was I could see myself turning into two people. One who presented publicly in a sort of asexual way, and then a sort of secret sexual self. And I really saw it as a real danger, and I have to avoid that situation. And so coming out just meant living as a whole sort of unified person. And I'm very fortunate in that I don't have any big trauma in my life. So there's nothing in my past that is particularly difficult to talk about. So no, I'm very fortunate in that way. So yeah, I find talking. I also I enjoy the sound of my own voice. so I do. I find it very easy to talk about myself.
But I think it's good because you put yourself in it makes the book very personable and very relatable. I suppose I'm a lot of the caveats that you put into this is how I interpret things. I'm in the same. I am a white man as well. In terms of I'm born in Britain. I'm of a certain generation, and so that gives you certain baggage. And so I think obviously I was like, okay, I know where he's coming from, but I can either understand if I didn't fit in with any or very few of these categories. I think it just helps set the tone as to, okay, where's this discussion going to be going?
Yeah.
Yes, I think Quakerism is just so personal, isn't it? I think, and that we are willing to share it, I think is so important, and share our experiences. That's what we come to do. And I think this book was great. I felt like I was I was just having a conversation with you about how this all fits together. Quakers do, I think, have a problem. I think I heard I listened to a podcast with you and Ben Wood about maybe the issues that Quakers might have with things like belief. So your book is titled Quaker Shaped Christianity, and immediately the minute that Christianity is there, automatically the brain starts thinking about beliefs and beliefs in Christ, belief in God, belief on this. And Quakers shy away from a lot of these like preconditions that generally when people think of Christianity that they think of. How does Christianity and Quakerism work together?
Yeah, because I think so. Christianity, and especially being in Britain, where Christianity is the state religion, Christianity has a very difficult history. There are forms of Christianity that have done a lot of damage, and so it's really understandable that people would be suspicious of Christianity, particularly like as you were describing Quakerism as a place that's sort of free of preconditions, a place to come and explore. I feel a lot of, and this seems to be the way a lot of people come to Quakerism. a lot of people come to Quakerism as sort of refugees, spiritual refugees from other churches and from having particularly negative experiences. I've spoken to many Quakers who have come from other churches and really, have rejected their past Christian experience as being something that was very unhelpful or even damaging. So I can understand. And my experience is that when I start talking about my Christianity, it's very a familiar experience is for other Quakers to become defensive, or to feel the need to explain to me why they don't believe what I believe, which is understandable. It also gets a bit wearing because I just want to be able to talk about my faith and not have to defend myself, or not have to deal with other people's the fact that it pushes other people's buttons. Because another way I'm very fortunate is I'm very glad I grew up in a non-religious family because I know so many people who did, for whom that experience was really awful. So my parents only ever wanted me to be happy. So I sort of I've come to Christianity with no baggage around particular Christian beliefs, which is, I'm very lucky that that's my position. So it's sort of being a Christian Quaker in Britain is a sort of constant negotiation between recognizing the baggage of Christianity and having to deal with other people's feelings about it, whilst also not getting worn down by other people's difficulties with it.
You mentioned it as well, and it's something that sort of jars with me a little bit. Is on Quakers in Britain front page, they describe Quakerism as being rooted in Christianity, but with that idea that maybe that's not where it is now. It's tricky because then people like you, people like me, who come to Quakerism with Christian language, Christian ministry, it does create. Well, is this what Quakerism is still about? I suppose one of my main questions is, in terms of these two bits and how they fit together, why did you choose to go for Quaker Shaped Christianity versus Christian Shaped Quakerism?
That's a very good question. So I'm definitely Quaker shaped because I've been involved with the Quaker community for the last 20 years. And I've been involved in all sorts of different ways, in local meetings and area meetings, yearly meeting, teaching at Woodbrook. I'm definitely Quaker shaped to the point where I don't think I will ever not be. This is the Quaker imprint is pretty permanent. But I think my primary identity is as a Christian. My husband is a Christian, but not Quaker. I'm part of an ecumenical house church thing. I really enjoy going to cathedrals. I have a lot of friends who are Christians in other churches. One of my most significant religious experiences was an experience. It was the first time I took bread and wine communion, actually, which feels like a bit of a confession as a Quaker. And I had this overwhelming experience of the unity of the church. And so I'm really into the one of my favorite lines from Scripture is the leaves of the tree is for the healing of the nations, from the end of the book of Revelation, and just this sense of being part of a bigger tree. So I'm very into unity of the church. So the Christian is my primary identity, and I'm a Quaker flavored one. Yeah, I think there's a Quaker form of Christianity that has a lot to offer the rest of the church. I also think Quakerism has a lot to learn from other churches. Every now and again, I'll hear a Quaker, whether this is somebody talking at yearly meeting or writing a letter to the friend, saying, "Oh, we need to drop the word worship." And for me, that's very difficult because from my theological understanding, I am created to worship. I feel that the whole of creation has been created to worship God, and worship is about resting in and enjoying God, and God enjoying and resting in us, and that's what we're created for. And that worship is something I do with other people. And I remember tweeting about my understanding of worship, and somebody replying, "Well, that's great that's for you. That's great. You do that, but just let other people do what they want to do in worship." It's like, but I want to do it together. I want to have a shared understanding. Yeah, if I was like a Quaker, if I was a Christian shaped Quaker, you might have this idea that I'm a Quaker with the Christian beliefs, and we've got a Quaker over here with their other sorts of beliefs, and we all fit together really nicely. And I think I want to highlight that tension there is between, it's not a case of we're all a collection of individuals with our own individual beliefs, and then we're all contained within this sort of bowl of silence. Actually, I don't want to be just one individual amongst a collection of individuals, each of whom do different things or believe different things. I want a sense of it being part of a shared thing. The Christian understanding of meeting for worship is that is our communion. Like, we spiritually, this is how Quakers have argued within the history of Quakerism, this is how it's been argued about what Quaker communion is. Quaker communion is the spiritual feeding on Christ in our worship.
I know, and the problem is that, and I think I remember that whole thread as it went on, and I think my main problem is that because Quakerism, and no one can deny, is rooted in Christianity, there's no other good word for it. Nothing else will encapsulate that in a way. If you try to make secular language to work with that, secular language isn't for that. So what would you do? You'd end up with something bland and something horrible if you called it. I think I saw meeting for silence, and as an alternative, and I balked because who's coming there for silence?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you should, and also the silence. Obviously, it's the mode, not the way, isn't it? Right?
Totally. And for me, it's also for me, worshiping captures that we come together not really to do or achieve anything. Like, I don't think meeting for worship, I think we can fall into a trap of seeing meeting for worship in a sort of instrumental way, in that we come to worship in order to achieve something, whether that's personal transformation and all of those things can happen in. I don't want to restrict what can happen in meeting for worship. All sorts of amazing things could happen in meeting for worship, including personal transformation of the community. But
not every Sunday.
I think not every Sunday, and also Quakerism in Britain, I think, can become possessed by this idea that we exist in order to save the world. And there's lots of terrible stuff going on that needs sorting out. But for me, God saves the world. We may participate in that work, but that's not what we're created for. We're not created to save the world. We can take that burden off our shoulders. We're created to enjoy God. We're created for joy. So we can just chill out. And a meeting for worship doesn't have to be a sort of anxious hand-wringing about how we can save the world. So I think that's also why, for me, naming what it is and it being worship is really important.
Yeah, I think it takes the pressure off, as you say, because I think sometimes, as you say, Quakers either feel they need to save the world, or that they need to be having this close connection with the inward light every Sunday and in full intensity, and that has to be shown in vocal ministry and all that, and that's just not what life is, and that is us as humans, but we're still there in the light, and that's what we've come to do together, as you rightly say. So I mean, I think they will never find another way of talking about it that'll make everyone happy, and so I think we will probably have. I think it's a beautiful word. If people don't, then maybe it's just we need to recapture it. I don't know. I think, and a lot of your book is taking a lot of these Christian words, which myself included don't particularly enjoy, and recapturing them in a Quaker setting, in a Quaker shaped, Quaker flavored way. So we'll come on and talk about those later. But I think the first thing that we've got to talk about before we really go into your book, because in proper, is that your book obviously is looking at the Jesus story, and apart from a few random notes in history from other historians, the Jesus story is in the Bible. And so we as Christians, or we as Quakers, or we as people trying to understand who Jesus is, have to read the Bible. How do we do that as Quakers? How did that your growing Quakerism and your growing understanding that you will have to encounter the Bible at some point fit together, and what were the challenges in that?
Mm. I mean, I had to read loads of books about the Bible before I could read the Bible itself, because the Bible for me really was off limits or it was incomprehensible. I couldn't find a way in. And so I read quite a few books, particularly books by people like Marcus Borg. So he wrote a book called Reading the Bible Again for the First Time, which is a book I would still recommend. I also read a book by John Shelby Spong called Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalists. Just hearing people talk about the Bible in a different way. Karen Armstrong's The History of God was the first book I read, which talked about Jesus just as a historical figure, and that was really that was something that really opened things up for me. And then, so once that sort of way was opened up, I was able to start reading the Bible and seeing it as a story to dwell in. I mean, one of the really important Quaker insights for the wider church is that Jesus is the Word of God. Christ is the Word of God, not the Bible. So and that means we don't have to take the Bible literally. The Bible is not the important thing we do is that we read the Bible in the spirit that inspired it. And so that means bringing ourselves to the text and into dialogue with the text, seeing the Bible as a conversation partner. So that means we don't have to take, we can play around with it. I mean, there's that whole, the Jewish tradition of Midrash, which is where it's sort of reading between the lines, writing, asking questions, really interrogating the text, asking questions about it, noticing what's missing. We're free. I don't want to appropriate a Jewish practice necessarily, but in a similar way, we're allowed to talk back. It's a dynamic relationship. It's not the Bible didn't fall out of heaven exactly as it is. It's not, the Bible isn't God. So it was written by people, and people aren't perfect. So it's a really important material and story for us to dwell in and wrestle with, and there's lots of really great stuff in there, and there's lots of really difficult stuff, but it's reflective of all the stuff that makes up humanity.
I think it is. I think when I read the idea of it being a conversation partner, that was great, because one, you don't have to agree with everything someone you're talking with says, or you can be radically changed by something that someone says. And I love this idea in Quakerism that we believe that Christ is speaking back, that we are speaking, and it's not just us taking this in and it's a one-way conversation. It is we discuss, we interact. I think that's really great. Mm-hmm. Suppose what we talk about the Bible, but then if we're looking at this as the Jesus story, for you, how does the Bible and Jesus fit together? How does the Jesus story fit within the Bible?
It's a community. So the church, the first century church, is a community trying to make sense of this Jesus event. And so for me, one of the things I say in the book is that there's the only way we can get to Jesus is to go through the eyes of the early church. Because from the Enlightenment onwards, we have this movement called the quest for the historical Jesus, and this idea that we can't trust the claims that the New Testament writers are making about Jesus. We have to sort of scrape away those layers of myth, of superstition, and we'll be able to get behind the Gospels and get to the real Jesus. And I mean, one of the things I maybe don't emphasize enough in the book is that I do think historical scholarship is important. I do think using like archaeology and all those things, having good knowledge about the first century context that Jesus was in is great, is really helpful in order for us to understand the New Testament better. But I don't think we can get to a Jesus shorn of all of the claims that the New Testament community was making about him. When I was working at Woodbrook, I was working with a scholar who was doing research into this, and the conclusion she came to was that Jesus was a failed revolutionary, doing this sort of process. And I think that we end up with this shadowy figure that we don't really know anything about, seems to have been a failure in what he intended to do, got a lot of things wrong. And yet, if we think Jesus is important, we then start to make Jesus up in a way, and we create a Jesus that looks a lot like us. Now, I saw a book a few years ago when Woodbrook had a second-hand book stand. There was a book called something like Jesus Was a Quaker. I was a little bit sick in my mouth. It was horrible. Just this, no, let's not do that. Let's not do that. Let's not claim. Let's not make those claims. Let's not project. But people do it all the time. People have done it all the time. Projecting ourselves onto Jesus and making a Jesus in our own image. So I think we need to look through the eyes of the first century church and realize how strange Jesus is, and how unlike Jesus is to, especially for me, speaking personally, the challenging strangeness of Jesus is really important. And wrestling with those claims that the first century church make about him and trying to understand them, and not just say it's all superstitious myth that we have to get rid of.
Yeah. And I think, again, as Quakers, we not saying that we necessarily do that, but I think, because Jesus is such a, you can look at that from so many different angles. I think there's a tendency maybe in Quakerism to focus on the role as Jesus as the teacher, to focus on Jesus as the one who is the moral teacher and things like that, following his example and all that, for lots of very good reasons. But the idea of Jesus as savior, as Jesus as God, how does that fit in with you? And I know in the book it plays out in a very interesting way, but how do you see these two understandings of Jesus within the Quaker tradition?
Well, so historically and geographically, the vast majority of Quakers would be happy with the sort of claim that Jesus is God, or that Jesus is divine. And in a way, the form of Quakerism we have in Britain is the aberration, is the weird offshoot. And what I find really interesting is that the first Quakers of the 17th century were accused of a heresy called doceticism, which means the heresy of denying the humanity of Jesus, which is, and looking at church history, all the big heresies at the beginning of Christianity were all about denying the humanity of Jesus. It wasn't the divinity of Jesus that people had a problem with. It was the humanity that people had a problem with. It was how could God sully God's self in such a way as to unite with humanity in this way. And the first Quakers talked a lot about the risen Christ. They talked about Christ, the Spirit of Christ. They talked about Christ in a way, sort of talking in a way similar to how Christians might talk about the Holy Spirit. I mean, I do think the first Quakers were Trinitarian, but they were Trinitarian in a bit of a odd way, and they sort of smushed Jesus and the Holy Spirit together. And so they emphasize, they love the letters of Paul, and they love the Gospel of John. And in the Gospel of John, you have a portrait of Jesus that is quite otherworldly. Yeah, and so they weren't so interested in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So so they really emphasized the spiritual risen Christ, and were accused of denying Jesus' humanity. Now we've flipped, and we're very, very comfortable with the humanity of Jesus. Like, if a Quaker was coming to me and saying, which book of the Bible should I read first? I'd say read Luke and then Acts, because I think that's most palatable to sort of a 21st century British ear, especially if someone who's been shaped by liberal secular culture. And it's claims about the divinity of Jesus and things like the Gospel of John that people find difficult now, and Paul especially. The early Quakers love Paul. Modern day Quakers hate Paul.
I didn't actually read the Gospel of John until I started going to meeting, and actually that was great, because like I was reading this book like, this is Quakerism. I just had this
Yeah.
the opening line. I remember just a bit like, what have I discovered? I think a lot of what I'm coming to grips with is that we have to be okay with nuance. I think we have to be okay as a society, both religious and secular, with the idea of nuance, and that there are different levels of understanding, to use Quaker term, different measures of light and things like that. And we have to be okay with this tension, as you called it, with this historical Jesus and the spiritual Jesus. And I think the Quaker message fits in really well with both and works with both really well. But there is a tension. I think we have to permanently, especially as one where we don't have a creed, we don't have any set beliefs or anything like that, we have to just be permanently open, permanently nuanced in what we're saying, whereas at the same time, living out our faith as well. The thing that I think, focusing on the Bible as well, when talking about how you read it, obviously you look solely at the New Testament. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then the letters, finishing off with Revelation. Now, in your book, you've take the Jesus story, but you deal with it in a very interesting way. I'll let you explain what that is and how it is you chose about it. But how did your telling of the Jesus story in this book play out in your mind, and how did it eventually come to how it is in the book?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Yeah, so in the book, I focus on after a couple of preliminary chapters where I talk about how I approach the Bible and why I'm focusing on one story rather than lots. So I sort of make some comments about universalism. The rest of the book is taking the major events of the Jesus story, but dealing with them backwards, starting at the end and working backwards. So I start with the second coming, and then go to the resurrection, then the crucifixion, and then I jump and miss out all of Jesus's ministry and jump to the nativity. And again, my 20 years ago, who I was then would be very disapproving about what I'm doing now in terms of telling the Jesus story like this. But the reason I'm doing it is because firstly, this is how the Jesus story made sense to me when it clicked. So I did a course in applied Christian studies. That was my first bit of theological education. For all of my theological education, I've had to go outside of Quakers to do it because it's not readily available within Quakerism. And this course called Workshop did a weekend. One of the weekends of the course was called Reimagining Hope, and it talked all about the end times and all the theology around the future. And it just lit me on fire. And I sort of realized that it's the end of the Jesus story, like the ends of lots of stories, that helps make sense of everything that's gone before. So the end of a story gives shape to the whole, and it puts everything else in perspective. Sort of a bit like a murder mystery, where the detective at the end explains what's gone on, and then the whole of the story makes sense. And so I think the end of the Jesus story is what makes sense of everything else. And we see this in the Gospels, in that the Gospels are being told from a post-resurrection perspective. During Jesus's life,
absolutely,
sort of pre-crucifixion, the disciples don't get it. They don't get it. They're constantly getting it wrong. It's only at the resurrection appearances that they understand. And also this has been very much heavily influenced by one of my favorite theologians, who's a German Reformed theologian called Jürgen Moltmann. He wrote a book in the 60s called Theology of Hope, and he sort of brought all of this sort of eschatology, it's called in theology, technical terms, like this theology of the end of the future. And he brought that back onto the scene and talked a lot about the light of the future sort of shining into the present. And so that's also been an inspiration for me in switching it up like this. also I miss out Jesus's ministry stuff because I think all of Jesus's ministry, all of his teachings, only make sense in the context of these other events. And so the second coming for me is all about the kingdom of God, and that's what Jesus's teachings are about. And a lot of his teachings are him pointing towards the crucifixion or the resurrection. So I think that's why I don't have a chapter on his earthly ministry, because I think it only makes sense within those big events. The nativity I put at the end. Now, I'm not invested in the nativity stories as historical events. I'm very happy to see those as sort of mythological origin stories. I mean, I think they're highly theological stories that making a theological point. And I see those as encapsulating all the other parts of the Jesus story. I see the nativity story as the seed, as like a seed that contains the rest of the Jesus story in it in various forms. It's always sort of, if the second coming casts its light into the present, the nativity is all about foreshadowing what's to come.
I wish I read, especially your bit on the nativity before, because I did a video just before Christmas on a Quaker on the nativity, and I should have read this beforehand, because you're obviously seeing the resurrection as a historical event, all of these events as being completely historical, but the nativity you see as mythological.
I think for me the nativity is less. It's less. I mean, it may be historical. There may be elements of it are historical. It's like I'm not invested in that being historical. The resurrection, I think, is different. Again, I don't know whether I'd even describe it as a historical event because it is so mysterious. Like I'm not going to make any claims that I don't have any understanding about the resurrection in terms of how it happened. And I think in the book I talk about the empty tomb. Like Jesus's body was put in there, and then it wasn't there anymore. We don't have the privileged position of seeing what happened. So it's sort of, I'm not going to say I understand it, but I think what for me is really important about the resurrection is if the resurrection didn't happen, whatever we mean by happen, then the rest of it doesn't make sense. And I agree with Paul when he says if Christ isn't risen from the dead, then our faith is based on nothing. And it's about this, and it's about this hope. What is the foundation for our hope for a peaceful and just future for all things? And for me, the resurrection is that foundation. And so that for me is a sort of, that needs to be there. The nativity stuff, I agree with the theology. I think the nativity stories make really important theological points. Whether there were really wise men from the east, whether there were really shepherds. The question I'm asking when I come to the Bible is not, is what I'm reading exactly true as it is being written? Like, is this a historically accurate presentation of what happened? I think that's the wrong question to ask when you come to Scripture. That's a very modern way of reading ancient documents. I think the question to ask is, what are these authors saying? What are they trying to say?
I suppose then this probably then linked to, because I was just reading that this was what you did your master's in, wasn't it? This postmodern Quaker eschatology. Was that when you first came across Jürgen Moltmann?
Yeah, so I was doing an MA in theology, general Christian theology, and I was wondering what to do for my dissertation. So I've done various other modules, and then I read a book by I read a book by Jürgen Moltmann called "The Coming of God," which is all about eschatology and like the end times. And I just connected with his writing so much, and then I've hoovered up all his major works, particularly his book. He wrote a book called "The Crucified God," which just blew my mind. Which is all about, I mean, he starts off the book by saying the cross is not something we can love. The cross is something we should hate. And because for Moltmann, he grew up in Germany. He was in the German Air Force during World War II. He was present he saw some terrible bombings in Germany, and he was captured and was a prisoner of war in England, I think maybe in Scotland as well. And all of his theology has been shaped really by the questions of how do we do theology after Auschwitz? How do we do theology after Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Like those are the questions that have shaped all of his theology. How do we make sense of Jesus, of a Christian God, with that in that shadow? And so his theology is just I find it really contemporary, it's very readable, deceptively readable perhaps, and just beautiful. He taught me that theology was something you could love.
I think we've kind of skipped a bit, and that was probably my fault, but we'll see if I can edit this back in. But one thing that I definitely do want to talk about, though, is, and it is before you go into the Jesus story in reverse, is the idea of Quakerism versus Quakerism and Universalism, not necessarily versus, and what the pros of incorporating a greater universalism within Quakerism might be, or what the pros are, and then what the negatives are. And I think, well, first off, do you want to maybe talk about what universalism is, and then maybe what it is in Quakerism, and what you think of its place within Quakerism?
Yeah. So I think, it's important to be clear about what we're talking about, because the word universalism has lots of different meanings. You could say one way of talking about universalism is the hope of universal salvation. And so in that sense, I could describe myself as a hopeful universalist, is probably how I would put myself.
Yes.
But then there's also a way that Quakers talk about, I think, and probably the way that most Quakers understand universalism is talking about what could also be talked about as pluralism. So this idea that all religious traditions are united by a common, there's this common spiritual experience that unites, or that there's this common foundation that all these other religious traditions are built upon, and that's the most important thing is this thing that all these religious traditions share, and are just different ways of speaking about the same thing. And I remember, in the book I use a couple of metaphors. There's the one of we're all taking different paths up the same mountain. There's the metaphor of the people with blindfolds who are all holding a different part of the elephant. And so they describe it in different ways, like the trunk and the tail and the ear are all described in different ways, but they're all describing the same elephant. I remember going into a Quaker meeting a number of years ago and seeing a sort of tree, a small tree in a pot, which had the sort of the symbols of different faiths sort of hanging off it, almost like sort of Christmas tree decorations, and then with a poster or something saying all faiths are the same, something like all, saying that they're all the same. So different branches of the same tree. So it's a similar sort of metaphor. Now, my big problem with that, and I don't have a problem with people being universalists. I think in that sense, I think the difficulty is when people present this view as if it's not a religious belief of its own, as if it's not a religious tradition of its own, as if it's set apart from the religious traditions, as if you're able to take a step back and have this bigger view, as in you're able to take a step back and not have a blindfold and see the whole elephant, or you're able to be up in a helicopter and see the whole mountain. I think, or see the whole tree. Whereas actually, you don't have none of us have that privileged position, and universalism, in that sort of pluralist sense, is a religious tradition like any other tradition. How do we know that there's this spiritual experience that everyone shares? I don't think how do we know that? And then there's other problems that come off that, because when you start to emphasize that as the most important thing, all the other aspects of different religious traditions lose their importance. And I've had that in talking with some Quakers about this sort of thing, like the cross in Christianity has been dismissed as being, well, one Quaker said to me it was a terribly parochial symbol, and I was like, the cross is a central, like, you take the cross out of Christianity, what? So, and that sort of encapsulated this sort of arrogance, really, of being able to say to someone of another tradition, the things you think are most important, they're not actually the most important. The most important thing is actually this spiritual experience that we all share. So I think it can very easily erase difference. Also, I think when you come into dialogue with someone of another faith, if you're taking this pluralist approach, you're sort of saying, how are we the same? Or not even that. You're saying, how are you like me? What in your tradition do I recognize as the spiritual experience that I have? How do I see that in your tradition? And which I think is and I still mention this in the book, I think this has very sort of colonial resonances. And I think it's much better if we come to a conversation and say, how are we different? Like, differences aren't anything to be afraid of. I mean, this is why I hate John Lennon's Imagine. I hate it, because it's this in John Lennon's Imagine, there's this idea that if we just get rid of all our differences, if we get rid of all religions, then we'll all get along. It's like, that's not peace. Peace is peace amidst difference, is an accepting of difference and getting along in difference. I think I just want to highlight that there are some problems. That it seems like, and I think this is how I initially approached it. It's like, this approach, this solves a lot of problems. It means we can be at peace. We can exist with all this theological difference within the Quaker community. We don't have to fight about it. And so people will talk about pluralism. And I saw somebody write a letter in The Friend describing it like this, as radically inclusive. But it doesn't include me. Like, pluralism is inclusive of pluralists. Pluralism is not inclusive of everybody, which is what pluralists seem to think it is, and it's not. And talking certainly about inclusion in that sense, it's like, well, I don't understand how we can talk about radical inclusion in terms of spiritual theological difference when we are a very homogenous community in so many other ways. Like, why aren't we if we're going to talk about inclusion, let's talk about including disabled people. Let's talk about including people of color. Let's talk about including neurodiverse people. Let's not just feel good about ourselves because we all believe different things. Even then, I think we talk about theological diversity, but I think the window of acceptable, expressible belief in Quakers in Britain is actually very narrow. I think there are other Quakers in Ireland, I think, do it a lot better. My experience of Quakers in Ireland is that they deal with theological difference in a much better, healthier way.
Yeah, and I suppose that's quite something I've noticed with Britain Yearly Meeting the last couple of years, is that the focus has been on greater inclusion of people of color, of people from different of accepting that there has been issues with race within Quakerism, that there has been issues with the acceptance of people from the LGBTQ community, and looking at that as well as saying, instead of saying, isn't it great that we can all get along because we all agree to disagree and that we're all on the same mountain. I think that's nice that we are looking to challenge that. And I think that's really important. I think the main things that I'm picking out from the book as well is that, as I said at the beginning, is that you try to rehabilitate the Christian language, and three bits that came out for me were particularly sin, the seed, which isn't a particularly difficult one to rehabilitate. I think it's probably more Quakers needing to reuse it again as a maybe much more flexible word, and Mary. I'm going to start with Mary first because I think because, as I said, I find this so difficult to talk about because talking about Mary is there's no real Quaker tradition of that, and obviously, because of the historical nature of it, Mary's associated with Catholicism a lot because of the focus that they put on Mary. That me as a Quaker talking about Mary seems very controversial. And so then when I was going through the chapters of the book and I said, what would Mary do? I was like, Mark Russ has got it. And he's on the same thing as I am. And so I suppose let's start there. How do you see Mary? How could Quakers use what we read about Mary, and how does that fit in?
Well, I think Mary is the archetypal Quaker. I'm not saying Mary was a Quaker, but I think she is a model.
No.
Because because she receives she receives God's word, like willingly. So like the angel comes, the messenger comes, and she says she has to think about it, and then she's like, yeah, go on then. And she births Christ. Like we talk about the inward Christ, like that sort of fits with Quaker language of Christ being within. And she has Christ within, and she births Christ into the world. So from that sort of perspective, like, and that lovely exchange between Mary and Elizabeth, where the babe, John the Baptist, Elizabeth's baby, leaps in the womb. And I read that and I think of George Fox's words about answering that of God in everyone. It's like, that's a lovely, I think that's a lovely image of that of God and those women being answered. I mean, maybe there's an issue with the fact that they're both giving birth to they're both giving birth to men, maybe. See, there does have to be, I need to be careful. I am aware, I think I put a paragraph about this in the chapter. I've got to be careful as a man, as someone who can't get pregnant, doesn't have an experience of pregnancy. I've got to be careful about romanticizing this imagery. And there are lots of women and feminist theologians who can talk about Mary in a better way than I can. But I think the Magnificat, so Mary's song, "My soul magnifies the Lord," like that is like, it's about bringing down the proud, bringing down the rich, and lifting up the poor. It's like this amazing theological, spiritual, political manifesto, which Quakers could totally get on board with. So I feel like Mary is just this figure who I aspire to be like in a spiritual way. I do, I submitted this manuscript for the book in the summer of 2021. So it's sort of, it's been a long time since I wrote this stuff. Since then, I have been reading some critical white theology that has talked about the what would Jesus do, and the problem with particularly white men asking what would Jesus do, and identifying with Jesus in that way. And some theologians have been offering, what would Zacchaeus do? And so Zacchaeus is the tax collector who's up in the tree. He climbs up the tree to get a better view of Jesus, and Jesus says, "Oh, come down." And Zacchaeus sort of goes, "Okay, I'll come down and I'll give half away. Yeah, I'll redistribute my wealth." And so they suggest that Zacchaeus is actually a much better person for rich white people to emulate. So maybe the chapter would be a little different, but I still think Mary's really great. I'm very into icons, like Orthodox icons, and I love the icon. There's an icon of Mary with the little child Jesus sort of in her womb. And also, one of the things I really love was discovering that in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Mary is connected with the burning bush. So of the story of Moses.
Yes.
So in icons of Moses, where you have the burning bush, there might be a little Mary popping out. Because just as the bush contained God and wasn't consumed, Mary contained God and wasn't consumed. And I think that's one of the things that Quakers have said is, look, we can contain God. This is one of the things that that was so scandalous in the 17th century.
I think the big one as well is sin. So obviously when I love how you deal with sin, because I think, if people, what does sin mean? It's the bad things that I do, it's the things that I hate about myself, and it's all this sort of, it becomes very self-loathing, and I love how you change that to talking in your talking in the book, to talk about sin as a way that isn't personal. Do you want to maybe just talk a bit about why?
Yeah.
Why that's not necessarily very helpful, and actually what the way that you then go to talk about it is more helpful, perhaps.
So I can totally understand why people reject sin language. If that sin talk has been used to make you feel disgusted at yourself, to hate yourself, and I know people for whom that has been the case, and certainly that's what it looked like to me in the Christians I knew, and the way they talked about sin. It sort of meant to be a Christian, you had to basically feel a load of shame that I didn't feel. So I was like, well, why do I need God then if I don't feel really ashamed? But then I sort of came to realize that if we don't use sin talk at all, if we don't have sin language, I think is actually very good for talking about sinful use of sin talk. Because we can use sin language in a sinful way. So, like someone saying, "Love the sinner, hate the sin," which to me is like, like that's what homophobes say. That's a sinful use of sin language. Like, I think we need a way to talk about the really terrible things that people do to each other and the mess that we're in. Like, we're not just dealing with the things that people alive are doing to each other. We're dealing with all of the wreckage of history, of all the terrible things people in the past have done. We're dealing with the legacy of past sins. So I talk about sin as I think the first thing we need to do is really not have any is to have self-love. I don't think we can talk, and this is one of the things Moltmann says. He says that sin talk is something is to be used only within the therapeutic community of the church. So if you think there are some churches where people will evangelize by trying to convince people about how sinful they are, and they see that as a way to get people in. Moltmann says only when you're within a community of love can you talk about sin in a healthy way. And so first, you need to be grounded in the fact that you are like God loves me. I'm created for joy. The creation is very good. God created it and said, "This is great." And if God is good and God created everything, God can only create good stuff. So I'm great. So when you start with that real sense of your own self-worth and from a place of love, then you're in a place to face, but actually I'm also pretty broken. And I live in a broken world, and I'm part of systems of sin. I'm part of like this sticky web of sin where I end up doing stuff that is bad without even trying. And so seeing sin as social, as systemic, and then because it's social and systemic, that's why it's personal. Because I am a person.
Yeah.
So systems and society are made up of people, made up of individuals who replicate those bigger patterns. You have to start from a place of affirming your goodness. Then you can face the terrible situation that we're in. And I think sin talk is very good at helping describe that.
I do wonder, obviously, with a modern understanding of systems and how they operate on international levels and things. But now, if we look at this on a social level, an international level, we can use this idea of systems, because we talk about systems of injustice, we talk and all of this stuff. And I think if we say, well, this is sin, then that can be helpful, especially as Quakers who are so into, and I think that's a really good way to get Quakers involved in or rehabilitating sin talk and using it as a way to as a way to help push for social justice and things like that.
Because I think we need a language that's serious enough. Like, I think the reason why sin I think the reason why we don't like sin is because it's such a serious word, and I think we need words of that weight. Even though we have to put on thick gloves to handle it with care, it's still a really valuable tool, because we're in terms of systems of sin, we're talking about the destruction of life on the planet. We're talking about climate collapse. This is the situation is really bleak in many ways, and so and I think the language of sin really captures that. But when I think of, say, white supremacy, when did I become shaped by white supremacy? Well, as soon as I started to become sort of encultured, as soon as I started to absorb my wider culture. And since babies can recognize their mother's voice in the womb, from that point of view, in terms of systemic, being shaped by a disordered world, that happened to me from the beginning.
Because Quakers tend to be quite tuned in to social injustice and things, to say, well, if we look at sin like that and we give it the language, as you say, which is powerful and hard hitting and people know is serious, then they kind of see why do Quakers care so much about trying to sort some of these problems out. And then so the seed comes up then next on my list of things that we're trying to rehabilitate, and I think this is more of a Quaker thing rather than a wider thing, but I think it's a really good word. I think it comes up in quite a lot of early Quakers. I first read it when I made the very long journey into Robert Barclay's Apology, and I was like, oh, that's great. And then obviously it does have biblical references as well.
So the early Quakers used lots of different images. They didn't talk exclusively about the light in the way that Quakers in Britain today do. They used lots of different images. They talked about the pearl of great price. They talked about truth in a similar sort of way. So a variety of different biblical images to talk about what was happening, and they talked about them in that they were the sort of same thing. So the light and the seed for early friends were basically the same thing. Then from the 20th century onwards, under the influence of Rufus Jones, who was an American Quaker who was incredibly influential in how Quaker culture in Britain changed from an evangelical one to a liberal one, because of the way he spoke, that sort of prompted a shift where the light became the primary way the Quakers in Britain talked about their spirituality. So the light has never been as well used by Quakers as it has been in the last century. And I don't have a problem with the light. It's in John's Gospel, opening chapters of John's Gospel, fantastic, love it. So I'm not saying let's stop talking about the light. I'm saying that maybe the light doesn't give us everything. Maybe the reason why the early friends used lots of different symbols and metaphors is because they all did slightly different things, maybe. I think maybe we could. I think one of my big missions within Quakerism is to say, let's widen our vocabulary. Let's resist this route that some people seem to advocate of getting rid of words, like getting rid of worship. Let's not get rid of words. Let's add more words so that we can have lots of different words to draw on, so that we can understand one another better. And I think the seed could help us do that. It's a seed that's got big Quaker pedigree. It's got really big biblical roots, and it maybe does something that the light doesn't, because I think the light can sometimes feel a bit of a static image. I mean, you can talk about light growing in intensity, I suppose, but I think for the seed has a particular journey in a way that the light doesn't. Like the seed begins as a seed and then goes through quite a traumatic bursting open and grows. So I think there's a dynamism to the seed that maybe isn't there in the light. I think the seed you can talk about the Jesus story through the metaphor of the seed, in terms of crucifixion and resurrection, like this idea of the seed being trampled on, but the seed being unstoppable, and the future, like the parable of the mustard seed, which is where it eventually grows into a tree that no one would have expected. And it links in with the tree in the Book of Revelation, the tree of life, which is one of my favorite images. So there's just something, I just love the imagery of the seed so much. And I feel like a non-theist Quaker could talk in terms of the seed in a way that had integrity for them. I feel like it's a symbol, it's a metaphor that we could unite around in the same way that we've united around the light. That the light has proved to be a really flexible symbol that that people can use who aren't Christians. I think the seed has that potential as well. Because I'm not advocating for Quakers in Britain to become Christian again, because that's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm not into forcing my beliefs on anyone. My sort of what I hope to help with is for the Quaker community to do theological difference better, in a way that we can communicate and be a community and not become fractured and splintered, which I feel there is a risk of that. So I think the seed could be a metaphor that we unite around, and that we could do. I think it's a flexible symbol in the way that the light is.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think what Robert Barclay calls it is, because obviously he wrote, he wrote the Apology originally in Latin, and the Latin for the seed was vehiculum, which is where we get the word vehicle from, which again has this sort of dynamism in it. And I think this book, I think what I loved about it so much was that it was personal, but because you put yourself out there at the beginning, I felt it was relatable because I was understanding where you came from, and you just were throwing out like a lot of these things, which I by myself, not a theologian in any way, but a lot of these thoughts that I was having out there, which I thought was just brilliant. I've got a couple of maybe fun questions to finish off with, if that's all right. Like quick fire questions. And so the first one is, Mark, who would you say would be your Quaker role model? So if you think about all the Quakers who have come before us, and you had to pick one as a role model, who would you pick and why?
Well, Thomas Kelly's book, Testament of Devotion, was such a formational book for me. It was one of the first really proper Quaker books I read, and it just rocked my world. So it would be wonderful to spend some time with Thomas Kelly. Fabulous book. So yeah, I'd love to spend some time with him. So many. There's so many Quakers living that I'd love to just spend some time with. There's a lot of role models out there. Yeah, maybe Thomas Kelly.
Thomas Kelly, yeah, good one. And then I suppose you mentioned in the book, and a lot of this book is about putting things together, and you could talk about a patchwork as well, which I think is really nice, trying to fit it all in and sew it all up. And so there are book recommendations, but I suppose the way I wanted to break this down is maybe if people, because there are some people watching this channel who are just interested in Quakerism and maybe aren't ready yet to tackle a lot of the topics maybe that we've covered in today, but just want to know, just getting into Quakerism, what would you recommend as maybe a good couple of books, maybe 2, 3, that you think would be a good place for them to start?
So I would recommend 2 books by Rhiannon Grant. So Telling the Truth About God, which I think is a really important book published in recent years. Really great. I feel it gives a sort of direction for Quakers. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Rhiannon's also written another book called Listening to the Light?
Hearing the Light.
Which is Hearing the Light, that's it. Which is a sort of trying to capture what liberal Quaker theology is, which I think she does really well. I think Rhiannon Grant's a really important contemporary Quaker voice in Britain. One of the things I really love about Rhiannon is that Rhiannon isn't a Christian, but I think she really demonstrates, like she's somebody I can speak to and I feel like she understands, because she knows she's taken the time to learn the language that I speak. So I think I really respect her as a Quaker theologian and as someone who really models she's somebody who models religious diversity, how to be in religious diversity. I think she models it really well. I'd also recommend this book by Marcel Martin, Our Life is Love, The Quaker Spiritual Journey. Marcel Martin's a Quaker from the States, and I read this recently, and it's a really beautiful book, and she draws a lot on the writings of early Friends, as well as Friends in the 21st century. So she sort of lays out the Quaker spirit, the sort of a pattern that Quakers have generally experienced. It's a really, really good book. So, and all of those ones by Rhiannon and by Marcel Martin, they're very readable, very accessible. So those would be my starting places.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll put some links to so that people, if they're interested, can go and find them as well. And then if people have, maybe more seasoned Quakers, I don't know, they've read your books, you've given a list, and what I really like is that you go like sort of chapter by chapter saying these are the books I would recommend for this is what I would recommend for this. If we were going to synthesize that down even further, and you were like, okay, I feel like I understand where you're coming from, I've got some biblical background, where would you see if someone finished reading your book at the level that they'd be able to fully engage with it, where do you think they should be going next? What should be their next read? I'm asking mainly for myself because I've just finished reading your book.
So I would say that if you want, in a way, the books that have really shaped my thinking, I would say Stanley Hauerwas, The Peaceable Kingdom. One of the first academic theology books I ever read, and it so much of what I say, the fact that I call it the Jesus story, and this focus on story and narrative really has its roots in Hauerwas's thinking. So Stanley Hauerwas, the Peaceable Kingdom. I mean, Moltmann. Read some Moltmann. Yeah, I mean, one of his most readable books is called Jesus Christ for Today's World. It might be tricky to get hold of. That's a sort of for a general audience. But if you're going to read one of his biggies, then The Crucified God is a classic. And yeah, for me was a tremendous reading experience. There's so much. I would say read some read some ancient stuff, like Athanasius on the Incarnation, and sort of to help you, because for me that was just, it's so poetic. It's so poetic. Those sort of early writings, or Gregory of Nyssa, The Life of Moses, is beautiful. Julian of Norwich, Revelations of Divine Love. And you see them use the Bible in such a poetic and beautiful way. Also, in terms of Quaker theology, Doug Gwynn, Apocalypse of the Word, that's another classic that really shaped my thinking of Quakerism. Also, C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce. C.S. Lewis is it's a bit tricky. So I think sometimes he's overrated. Certainly, his book Mere Christianity, I wouldn't bother with. I think that's not. He's at his best when he's talking in sort of metaphorical language. He's at his best when he's the Screwtape Letters, or the Great Divorce is deceptively deep, deceptively simple. There's some real depth to it. I mean, with C.S. Lewis, some of his stuff is tinged with sexism and racism. Because
of a generation, definitely.
Yeah, but I think there's still some stuff in there that's really, and The Great Divorce remains one of my favorites. So those would be maybe in terms of, those are the books that have really shaped my thinking. I mean, now I'm sort of and thinking about that list, it's like a lot of them are dead white men. So I am at the moment, in the last year, I've been trying to broaden that out. So things like James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Kelly Brown Douglas, Stand Your Ground is Amazing. So yeah, there's definitely, I'm on a journey to widen my uh to widen my reading list, to widen my library. But yeah, those would be the books that I would, in terms of if you want more of the sort of stuff I'm talking about in the book, those are the books that I would urge you to go to.
Brilliant. I think one sort of last question, I suppose, in terms of where is will there be more to follow? What are your future projects? Are you planning more to be published? What are the next projects for Mark Russ?
So I'm doing a PhD now, so that's like a big project. And
Yep.
yeah, so that's I'm sort of absorbed in that, and so hopefully there'll be offshoots of that coming out. Like there'll be things that sort of mini projects that come off that. I think I've so this year, in fact, my blog Jolly Quaker is 10 years old, so there's a lot of material on there that could be turned into a book. I think a slightly different book, so more of like an essay collection rather than the sort of book that Quaker Shaped Christianity is.
And so I suppose then, as like a final bit, is there, if people want to find you and follow you and get more Mark Russ in their life, where can they go? How can they find you?
So you can follow me on Twitter. That's sort of my public-facing theology, random thought sharing platform. Or go to my blog, jollyquaker.com, and you can get in touch with me via that if you need to. And I've got all the information about my book there, and that's where I put my blog posts and other information. I'm no longer a member of staff at the Woodbrook Quaker Study Centre, but I am an associate tutor there. So I run. I still do the odd course there. So you can look out for any courses that I'm running through the Woodbrook Quaker Study Centre. So yeah, those are the places you can find me.
And I will put all of those down there in the description so people can follow him. Yes, because I think you were one of the first Quaker theologian that I followed on Twitter, and that really started me being able to get involved with that just a lot more. So very much worth a follow. So Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would just ask again, recommend, please do go. I'll put a link in the description below for people that would like to buy Quaker Shaped Christianity. It's a fantastic book. And I really appreciate, Mark, you taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.